Mr. Sharma in about 10 minutes. They had some bilateral WTO talks or small side sessions on the WTO, which is the norm here at the World Economic Forum. The Doha round's been going on for nearly 10 years. I hope they make a bit more progress than they have been.
In the next 10 minutes.
In the next 10 minutes. He'll join us, and then we'll be joined also after his other session by Minister Nath of Road Transport and Highways, who I'll call upon at one point as well. So if you see different people coming in, that's the reason why. Let me declare something at the beginning. I usually have a pretty good, mellow broadcast voice, but I did this sand to snow coverage for CNN this week, which took me from Riyadh directly to Davos. And along the way, somewhere in between on the flight, I lost my voice, and I've been trying to coach it back for the last 3 or 4 days. So if I sound like a frog or like a sexy man, that's the reason why. It's not intentional, to be candid, so I don't want any of the men thinking differently. It's great to have everybody here. For the session on India, we have a fantastic panel mixed up from the business community, key players from Parliament, and of course from this cabinet right across the board. I think if you look at how this meeting's progressed over the last 3 days, there's a couple of major central themes. Number one, if you're looking west, you've got phenomenal debt overhang and a big question of when you pull out the stimulus packages and then whether you raise taxes and what impact that would have on growth. That's just one side of the world, if you will, in an economic way. The other side of it, and I think often it's been acknowledged, the growth of the East, but not quite as much as it should be. And I still see the discussions here that's centered on the European economic policy and whether the U.S. is going to recover, and we know because of their size it's very important for global demand. But at the same time, this downturn, the worst in 60 years, has proven there's great power in the East, and it's only going to get even better. From India, from the Middle East, stretching into China, looping all the way down into Southeast Asia. I like to call it the rebuilding of the old Silk Route and the old spice routes. And people say, oh, it sounds very romantic on your part. But the reality is it's underway. We have a Look East policy in India that's been fortified to look into the ASEAN community, add members into ASEAN in a broader way, the 6 countries, to leverage growth. And what that will mean for the next century. And what does that mean for India today? We know the growth numbers of about 7.5%, 8% for 2010, average growth of 8% over the last 4 years. But the game is not over yet, and this is one thing that we even said to each other before we sat down. If you think that the building of India is finished and the social policy is done, we're gravely mistaken, with about 300 to 350 million people still living below the poverty line. The infrastructure that's being built, that's why we're having Minister Nath join us a little bit later, a vital component of it. And then, deregulating all different aspects of the economy to unleash this growth for the next 25 to 50 years. That's kind of where we are today. Sub-chapters, of course, to it is India's foreign policy on the nuclear front, the role it played in Copenhagen as well, which was, again, for observers from the West, they're like, oh, I can't believe India played that role at Copenhagen. Well, I think again, because it's going to be that way from this point forward. We'll have discussions for about 40 minutes, and then I'd like to open the floor up for Q&A from you for the final 20, and we'll pepper that in between. So do have your questions ready, and we'll get to that in the final 20 minutes. I've asked each one of our panel members if they would be so kind to keep their opening comments to 90 seconds because of the limited time we have. It's got to be hard out at 3, gentlemen, because of a panel that's taking place right afterwards. So I'd like to start, if I may, with Montek Ahluwalia, the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, a very essential role. I know a lot of Indian people in the audience know his role, but for those who don't, it's one of the key essential hubs of all the different economic activity and social policy in India. It sits right at the center of it. Mr. Ahluwalia, do you want to give us your 90 seconds on you see the future agenda as key priorities going forward? Because we know the India growth story today. Do you want to take us to the next policy agenda?
No, I think, we've had a good 2 years in battling a downturn. I think we did quite well. Dropped from about 9% growth to an average of 7 in these 2 years. I mean, the objective now is to get back to 9. That's not going to be easy. It's good that we've been able to hold the growth at 7%. I think we need to do a lot more to get it up to 9. The way we perceive it, one key challenge, obviously, is that we'll have to jack up the growth rate at a time when export demand will be weak. And we have to factor in that there'll be less export demand than we originally would have hoped. And what's going to make up for it, hopefully, is investment in infrastructure. So a lot of the government's energy in terms of policy, structure, implementation, etc., is really geared to making it possible for investment in infrastructure to take place. The other thing is, like in every other country, growth has to be inclusive. So there's a lot of inclusiveness agenda which we have put out, and health, education, development of rural infrastructure, and support systems for agriculture are all part of that inclusive agenda. So all of those things put together is really what the government should be doing. I mean, for the rest, we have a very vibrant private sector. It's done very well. It seems to have a high level of confidence, more confident, actually, than the industrial, than the private sector is in the industrialized countries. So we hope that they will remain buoyant and that animal spirits will keep the economy going.
Good. Thanks very much. I'll come back to you because you raised all different points I wanted to touch upon. Shyam, Saran, when I talked about the foreign policy of India and the role it's playing, you've been an absolute essential player on both the climate change discussions and the role of India, and perhaps more importantly, it's the U.S.-India nuclear agreement, and where you pulled together 45 of the suppliers group, each individually, to get agreement that India could, in fact, proceed with its nuclear policy. This is a big change for India in the last 5 years. In fact, your job over the last 2 years has been one racing around the world on two different fronts, climate change and nuclear. Do you want to give us an outline of those two key essential policy points?
Going ahead from where we are today, I think it is very obvious that if India wishes to maintain an 8 to 9% rate of growth, which it considers necessary in order to eradicate poverty, to meet the kind of economic and social goals that we have set for ourselves, inclusive growth, there is no doubt that energy will become a very important constraint. And therefore, unless we are able to meet the challenge of energy and meet the challenge of energy in an ecologically sustainable manner, that is really the challenge. And how India positions itself in that global game of innovative energy, in terms of clean energy, I think is going to be a very determining factor of India's continuing success and sustainability. The other thing, of course, I would like to stress is that the world of the future is going to be one that is based on knowledge as the most important resource. And therefore, how does India position itself to be in the front ranks of that knowledge economy is going to be a key factor. And lastly, I would say, India has a great asset in terms of its the universal appeal of its own culture and artistic temperament. How do we mobilize that great asset that we have, utilizing that universal appeal of India's art and culture? I think that also is going to be a very major challenge. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Gentlemen, thanks for being so direct and brief here. If I can bring the opposition representative to the table here. No. Mr. Singh, parliamentarian with the BJP, somebody I've chaired panels with in the past. Is there an agreement now on what is the future agenda? There's big sticking points here between the coalition government and from where you sit today. The job's not done, I know, is one of the issues that you want to underline here. We can't get too arrogant at this stage of the economic growth cycle, but how do you see the future agenda?
Well, I think that to the question, is India doing well? Yes, India is doing well. Will it survive the withdrawal of the stimulus package and the steroidal effect it may have had? Yes, but are we doing enough to realize the full opportunities? Are we meeting India's expectations? Are we meeting global expectations? The answer would be a very mixed one. Why? Because I think that some of the critical challenges which remain very under-addressed include how to improve the efficacy and quality of public delivery systems. How do large public outlays translate itself into making a real difference in the life quality of the people for which they are intended to? Is infrastructure being upgraded rapidly enough? Perhaps not. Are we paying enough attention to education to derive the demographic dividend? We are paying attention, but the speed at which we are doing is under-addressed. Is agricultural productivity being increased rapidly enough, not only for ensuring food security, but of ensuring that rural incomes go up? Perhaps not. Are we rapidly moving into the kind of technological changes to move the economy forward into what Shyam rightly described as low-carbon intensive economic activity patterns. These are huge under-addressed issues, and these are challenges which will require a lot of political leadership and forging of bipartisan support across regional parties, across states, across large divides, to get a whole host of pending legislative agenda, which has remained in the deep freeze for the last 5 years, to be pulled out to enable India to catapult and partially at least realize the under-addressed challenges and the huge opportunities which we need for ourselves and which we owe to the world.
Okay. It opens up for some questions. Afterwards, we'll come back to you. On Mr. Srinivasan, you're president of the CII, but also a chief executive of a manufacturing group that makes two-wheelers and is one of the largest auto parts suppliers, if I understood it correctly, in India as well. And I, for our CNN programming this week, spoke to Minister Sharma and Mr. Nath, and we talked about broadening out the manufacturing base to create high-end jobs and to broaden into the rural communities to bring that manufacturing base out of the core city centers of India as well. Is economic policy and the agenda on the policy front supporting that effort the way you see it today?
I think you raised a very fundamental point, but I'd like to add one more on agriculture as well. But talking about manufacturing, we need to create in India 100 million jobs to take care of the aspiration of the youth and the inclusiveness that the government keeps saying again and again. But it's not happening. And the reason we are not reaching our due position in the manufacturing world, our manufacturing is only 15% of GDP, needs to be at 30%. Why? There are but 4 issues. One, our infrastructure is abysmal. We're investing only 5% on infrastructure. China invests 10 or 11%. We need to double the rate of investment. But subsidies eat up our fiscal deficits, and there's no money left for infrastructure. Second, reform has been done only at the federal government or central government. State governments, including land acquisition, factories rules, shop rules, labor acts, all that remains in place, swathed in red tape, and nothing has really changed as far as regulations are concerned. But most importantly, we don't have the right to free interstate commerce, even though it's enshrined in the Constitution, because every state has state checkposts, and the state's rights to levy those checkposts and obstruct trade has been considered till now more important than the constitutional provision for free interstate commerce and trade, which we borrowed from the American Constitution. And now we are talking about a major reform, goods and service tax, which will significantly change this. Then, of course, you come to ports. I think roads are making good progress, but ports and electricity is not on the agenda, or it is on the agenda but not happening. We will miss our planned targets by at least 50%.
Then 50%.
Anyway, Montek can disagree.
Come back. Okay. At least you're laying the framework for a good debate here. That's
yeah, good. I think we need some debate. But let me come to agriculture. I think right through the 20 years, agriculture has got neglected in terms of 3 or 4 issues. We've been giving them money in terms of subsidies, which are not fully well directed. Water is not priced. Electricity is not priced. What does that do? I'm not worried about subsidy being given to the poor. I think India is a socialist country to a sense. We have a social conscience. We need to protect those who have been left behind. But misdirection of subsidy causes mining of water, which is irreplaceable. 2, urea subsidy puts more urea and leaches the soil and destroys the soil. 3, we do not have agricultural reform in terms of the Marketing Act, which still allows middlemen to control the market for grains. And finally, I would like to say that agronomy, extension services, seed and practices have really not got attention from successive governments for 20 years. We did our green revolution many, many tens of years ago, and since then, our agricultural productivity is half of China. So we need to create 100 million jobs, we need to create rural wealth, and we need to give subsidies or give support to make the farmer more productive and more prosperous.
Good. Thanks for the excellent overview. Minister Sharma, welcome to the panel. If you don't mind, I'm going to let you catch your breath, and we'll let you go in what we call in the American vernacular of baseball, the cleanup batter here, so you can take in one more introduction and then give us your thoughts, okay? Come right to you. Reuben, if you can, we wanted you on the panel because of your role as an academic, of course, but also a member of the Young Global Leaders, which looking at the next generation of leadership in India right now, and specifically whether we're laying the conditions in this economy and within a policy apparatus to foster the entrepreneur culture in a broad-band way, as we talked about with the introduction there by Mr. Srinivasan on the manufacturing base. Do you want to pick it up from there?
Sure. I mean, obviously, as a representative of the youth of India on this panel, I mean, it is my country, and it will remain my country. I mean, I am probably going to be living in India for a fairly long time, so it matters the set of reforms that are put into place today. But as somebody who's sitting on the outside of the policy establishment looking in, one of the things that has always occurred to me is there is a certain shyness from admitting the fact that reforms are fundamentally good for India. And in the political class, there's been a certain shyness. As a person who works on developing market-based solutions to promote economic growth, and specifically in areas where there are socio-economic problems, all the evidence seems to point in the direction that reforms are fundamentally good for the removal of poverty. The problem is not too much of reforms. The problem is too little reforms. The problem, of course, I mean, and I understand it full well, is that the payback period of reforms is longer than the political cycle. But that is the sign of leadership for somebody who can actually bridge that gap between the payback period of reforms and the political cycle. So, that is something that I probably look forward to from my leadership in India.
Okay, thanks for that. That's a good issue to bring back. Anand, Sharma, I had the pleasure of interviewing you this week for our program, and we had a chance to look at where you're going in terms of the trade round and the discussions you just had now, the Look East policy that you've established, and a major policy speech in Chennai during the India Partnership Summit just 1 week ago today, which was picked up right around the world for those who follow Eastern development. And then the economic policy. How do you see that ministry now that you've taken in as a portfolio? There's been a lot of different issues brought up. Montek brought up the concept of where he's trying to take the policy planning apparatus forward. How do you see your role now? And then the bigger picture, India's role looking east and where it's going to harvest its future generation of growth?
See, first of all, we have to look at the evolving picture in India, both in the domestic context as well as the global context. There have been many concerns expressed in the past whether we have been too slow and we have done too little or too much or too late. The fact is that in a democracy where you have coalition governments, where you have to create a consensus to carry your people along, to carry your voters along, there may be delays in implementation or taking decisions, which has been there in the earlier stages when we took the first tentative steps with the present Prime Minister, who is accepted in the world as a transformational leader, Dr. Manmohan Singh. But after that, whatever policy changes we made, they have endured. There are no abrupt U-turns. Investors are assured, people are assured. When we talk of expectations, there are bound to be expectations in a country which is an ancient civilization, but a young nation state. A country of 1.1 billion people, which is 750 million Indians, who have the same dreams and aspirations that the young people anywhere in the world would have, of their government, of their policymakers. And the government and the policymakers also recognize that they are the future stakeholders, and therefore the need to invest in them. But a question of that comprehension or understanding in a country which is still emerging from decades, if not centuries, of forced backwardness and deprivation and dehumanizing poverty is different from the age of television, 24/7. Even while we are sitting here, there are demonstrations outside. In November, when I was in Geneva, there were big demonstrations in Geneva against the WTO. So how you make people understand whether they are literate or less literate, that remains a universal question not restricted to the geographical territory of India alone. Having said that, I would also like to say that for us, last year was important. When we are talking of the future agenda, I think in continuity. Continuity does not mean stagnation. Our civilization has grown, evolved, sustained over millennia. But it's with the message of continuity with change. We have kept on evolving. Because if you do not, then you do not remain alive as great civilizations do. But last year we had elections in a very difficult backdrop. We have 714 million voters, the largest democracy on the planet. And it's our people who decide whether the course the governments have chosen is right or wrong. The voters reaffirm their faith and trust in the Indian National Congress, in Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and the policies which we have pursued. To me, it was a vote for a secular India, a pluralistic, multilingual, multi-ethnic country, of which we are proud of. It was also a vote for development, for inclusive growth, and development that is sustainable. We are a country of paradoxes. They are extremes. Not the only exception. Many of the developing countries, irrespective of the number of the people that inhabit that country, the story is the same. There are people who are very rich. There are people who barely manage to survive and see the next morning. We are talking of 500 million Indians who have no access to commercial energy. We are talking of a world in which 1 billion people have no access to, no food security at all. So therefore, how to harmonize while making the policies? It's true what my dear friend Venu was saying about subsidies, but if you look at the perspective of a policymaker, finance minister, or prime minister, it would change. Can there be abrupt withdrawals without putting the alternatives in place? My answer would be no. Our concern for our food security is the same. I entirely agree that we have to invest in our human resources, in capacity building, and today is the time for India to take the leadership initiative for the second green revolution. The first brought us food security. We were no more dependent on outside aid. The second must propel India to the leadership position. It's important because 700 million Indians still depend on agriculture. It may not be contributing the same percentage to our GDP. Next would be the priority to invest in human resources. When I refer to the numbers, it's 20% of the world's children live in India. For the next 4 decades, the largest number of skilled manpower, engineers, doctors in the world will come out of India. Globally, there is going to be a shortage. The manufacturing hubs of the world are in poor state of health. If I do not want to use a stronger word. And they will shift to a country like India. There's a projected global shortage of 40% of skilled manpower by 2025. From where that would be met? America will not face that situation, but I'm afraid most of Europe may. That's why our decision to invest in institutions of excellence. Today, India is creating more Indian institutes of technology, more Indian institutes of management, more Indian institutes of science. We have almost 1,500 new polytechnics coming up, 10,000 skills training center coming up. Our own needs for skilled manpower would be enormous. Maybe 300 million in another 2 years and 500 million by 2020. So that is where we are thinking, and we are moving in that direction. It's true that there are, as policies evolve, as societies evolve, there are issues which come up, questions which are there. And we are mindful of that, of changes within our system for better governance, more accountability, more transparency, and empowerment of the people. After India's independence, when we chose the path of parliamentary democracy, that was in one single stroke empowering the people 3/4 majority were poor. And the same number, if not more, were illiterate. But by giving them the right of vote, they were made participants in our democratic system. They felt that their word matters. Today, by giving them right of information, is the accountability of the administration and government ensured, and is the second most revolutionary step forward to empower our people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the policy outline there. Mr. Singh, you wanted to jump in here, and Kay, in terms on the policy front. And then I have 3 or 4 kind of key questions following up on the minister's statements. Please.
No, I just wanted to say that the minister is right in saying that in a system of parliamentary democracy, we need to forge a degree of consensus. I want to go back to what Mr. Reuben had said earlier, whether the constituency for economic reforms and rapid legislative changes which are needed, whether that constituency has shrunk. And what can we do to enlarge that constituency in the obvious belief, which has been demonstrated by data, that the kind of reforms India has pursued since 1991 has helped India catapult into a high growth trajectory. My colleague in the upper house, Mr. Rahul Bajaj, who is here in the audience, will share the view that unfortunately in Parliament and in the Indian legislative fabric, the constituency for economic reforms in India has indeed shrunk. What can we do to really forge greater political consensus, bring the kind of divides among political parties on some of the key issues which are necessary for India to go forward? And they are the kind of issues which have been mentioned by Minister Sharma. They are the kind of issues that Montek referred to. There is not too much controversy on that, but some of the key action there remains pending for far too long. Action on reforms of the financial and banking system, action, for instance, on reforming the education sector, some of the key action which remains in India's labor law, and some of the kind of activities which Venu had rightly mentioned on land acquisition and how to give India the advantage of a manufacturing hub, which is critical for creating the several 100 million jobs which will be necessary in the next few years.
Okay. Montek, you're shaking. I'm going to go to Reuben afterwards.
You see, I think
pick that up. He talks about a policy roadblock and many things that are moving very slowly through the democratic process.
No, let me say, I agree with a lot of what has been said, that we need to do a lot more. But I think you need to put these things in proper perspective. What is the most important thing that was facing the government in the last 2 years? It was not to push ahead with a well-known agenda of reform. It was to manage what was a humongous slowdown. I would say that 90% of the energies of the government were devoted to making sure that India's growth, we knew it was going to slow down a bit, but that its performance kept India on a high growth path. Now, an average growth rate of 7% per year in 2 years of the worst performance in the world economy, I would regard as an outstanding performance. And quite frankly, it is not easy in a government to, you don't have a sort of a blunderbuss or kind of a shotgun approach where you keep shooting bullets all over the place. I mean, if you're going to get something done, energies get concentrated. Now, I think the time has now come. And incidentally, this was done in the middle of an election year. And I think, as the minister pointed out, I think the government is well aware that it has won an election, come back stronger after a downturn, because I think people appreciate that it was well managed, okay? I have no doubt whatsoever that the reform agenda will, in fact, have to be done. I disagree with NK that parliamentary support has shrunk. Parliamentary support is unarticulated. And the truth of the matter is, this is where the government has to take a leadership role. Now, many issues of reform are controversial. I mean, for example, I agree with Venu that, most of our agricultural subsidies are dysfunctional. The Planning Commission has actually said that, so I'm not revealing anything. And I recognize, by the way, most of the industrial country subsidies are also hugely dysfunctional. They're a massive distortion of the global economy. We are realistic. We realize you can't change that very much. You have to realize that we will find it difficult. But to rule out the prospect of progress because some fiddly little agricultural subsidy, however dysfunctional it might be, can't be changed, would be just grossly wrong. Now,
Well,
let me just finish. The only issue...
You make it sound very minor. I'm kind of curious how big that budget is.
Venu said there's a lot of progress in roads. It's a pity that Kamal Nath is not here, but I'm sure he'd like to hear that. I agree with him, by the way, that on ports, we haven't made the progress we needed to. Where I disagreed with him was on electricity. Now, actually, if you ask me, you do these things plan by plan. In the 10th plan, which ended a couple of years ago, it's true that our addition of capacity was about 50% of the target. In the 11th plan, which is going to end in 2012, it's true that we're going to fall short of the target, but this was a very ambitious target. We're going to be adding 3 times the capacity that we added in the previous 5 years. Now, these are plants that are actually underway. You don't see them finished yet. An electric generating plant takes about 4 years to come up. So I'm guaranteeing you that at the end of the 11th plan period, people will say they fell short of the target, but they did 3 times what they did in the previous 5 years. So that's really a measure. You know, it's the usual, the glass is either half full or even sometimes 3/4 full. If the measure is it full, almost certainly it's never full because, you know, we set targets which are very high. So I think you've got to keep all that in mind. I mean, our friend here who said younger people are pushing for reform. Parliament is not unaware of the fact that the majority of voters are vastly younger than they are. And I mean, there was a recent Pew survey. You know, India has the highest percentage of people in favor of global openness, integration, positive view, etc. So quite frankly, Parliament should wake up and smell the coffee, and I think they will. So I'm not at all negative on this.
Well, just 1 second. I'm glad that in order to make this program interesting, Montek and I are disagreeing, which will, of course, make this program perhaps more interesting. But in order to find out how much parliamentary support has shrunk or has increased, I'd certainly encourage Montek to join us in Parliament to be able to assess this for himself.
Reuben first, and then Vinu, I'll come to you. Thanks.
Sure. I mean, the challenge that I'd put in front of policymakers, I actually agree with what Mr. Ahluwalia just mentioned. The key is to remember is we've had this so-called outstanding performance, whether it's 8%, 7%, in spite of the policy impediments, in spite of the lack of labor reforms, in spite of the lack of infrastructure. The way I would look at it is, now imagine a world in which we had the right reforms. What if we had the infrastructure? What would growth look like? That's number one. Number two, I still go back to the point that I made earlier. There is no attempt made by politicians to actually communicate with the people that reforms are fundamentally good. That attempt is, I see no evidence of that attempt. I mean, it's always...
Well, you could serve as a contrarian. There was a overwhelming re-election, first time since 1962. I mean, that's a pretty good vote.
You can analyze that vote and come to entirely different conclusions as to what caused that particular election result.
No, sorry for interrupting.
Sure.
Read the message of the government and the Congress party to the voters in the last election. The voters have endorsed and reaffirmed the path taken of inclusive growth, of change and economic development.
No, I agree.
That was the message. So it's not that the government is not communicating. Had we not communicated, then we would be sitting in the opposition. Had we lacking in individuals in policy-making positions, whether as ministers, whether Montek and his team, or those in parliament, we also had governments before us when we went out of power. So if there were more people then, the question would arise why they were thrown out and why we have been voted back.
I'm not disputing the electoral fact at all. What I'm disputing is the fact that the economic reform agenda has not been sold. The inclusive growth agenda has been sold. But the fact that reforms are fundamentally good has not been sold well to the public. The inclusive growth, I agree with you completely, Mr. Sharma.
Okay. I will just say, I know I hate adding that. I entirely agree with you. But you see, for a country like India, given its extremes, it's difficult. You see, it's difficult to sell it to the US Congress that global trade is good and move on in the WTO.
I want to come in on the agricultural issue. I'm sorry to harp on it. From the CII perspective, we need to achieve 12% GDP growth. And 12% GDP growth will come only in addition to what the wonderful service sector, most of whom of my friends are sitting there in front of me, have contributed to India's strength in services. We need to replicate it in manufacturing and agriculture. When it comes to agriculture, I think we have to look at, I'm not saying that overnight, I fully agree with my friend Mr. Anand Sharma, that we need continuity and change with continuity in a democracy. But there has been no attempt to change it. Our fertilizer subsidies are only worsening by the day in favor of urea, leaving out in NPK we have only N, and that's also spoiling our water. We don't have P, we don't have K, for this phosphorus and potassium. So second, we look at electricity. By just allowing free electricity, you're pumping out our water and making the soil saline. We stopped extension activity. Our agricultural productivity is half. So in terms of food security, in terms of prosperity, in terms of everything, you want to create this 12% growth economy and make it a very inclusive growth economy. It will not happen unless the agricultural next revolution takes place.
Reuben, just a second. Mr. Saran, you wanted to jump in.
Just wanted to comment on what was said about, that inclusive growth has been sold, but reforms have not. I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding, because I think reforms, in fact, are necessary for inclusive growth. That's the way I look at it. So you cannot have inclusive growth unless you have reforms. And the vote is really not for less reform. The vote has been for more reform. When people are looking in India at the lower segments of the ladder, economic and social ladder, they want more of what they see the segments of the population which have actually benefited from reforms. So they want more of that rather than less of that. I think that's something to be understood. Secondly, I would also like to mention here that with respect to agriculture, we have, because of the climate change aspect of agriculture, we have in fact a national mission on sustainable agriculture, which has been adopted by the Government of India. And many of the elements that we have in that climate change action plan, relating particularly to agriculture and to water, is precisely to take us in the direction that you mentioned. That we have to move away from a strategy of agriculture, which was very successful, by the way, for the last 40 years. When you concentrated, hybrid seeds, chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides, water-intensive cultivation methods, all these actually delivered that first green revolution. But that has run out of steam. And now the downside of that strategy is very obvious. So there is a need to shift from that strategy of agriculture to one which is less intensive in terms of its requirement for water, does not depend upon chemical fertilizers and pesticides. There are very, very good alternatives which are available, which, by the way, have been actually tried out and have succeeded in states like Andhra and states like Karnataka. The challenge really is how do we upscale that to a national level. So I don't think we should have a sense that the government is not mindful of what is required and is not doing anything about it.
Sir, only one comment, just one line. China produces 600 million tons of organic fertilizer from city waste. Indian city waste is by and large still untreated.
No, I think that where Venu is absolutely right on that limited point, that the Prime Minister has been visionary enough to say 23 times in the last 4 years the need to get rid of distortionary subsidy. Now, it's really for the policy implementers to carry out what the Prime Minister has pronounced on 23 occasions.
Okay.
I just want to clarify one thing, and I think Venu mentioned that earlier.
I like the fact you guys don't get a chance to debate back home, but you do it here. Go ahead.
No, I just, I think he made a very important point that there hasn't been enough reform in the states. Actually, it varies across states, but 90% of the agricultural policy issues are state government issues. I mean, all this middlemen, marketing reform, etc. No, we keep saying the right thing to the states, and we still have to persuade them. So I want to clarify that on many of the things he said, the government of India is not only aware of it, but actually pushing. Even on fertilizer subsidy, for example, we are moving to a nutrient-based subsidy rather than the urea thing. So it's slow, and I don't think we are doing enough, but I think that's the context.
Okay. Before we move on to the floor here, I wanted to bring up two kind of essential issues, and then I'll take the floor for questions the rest of the time. So, Saran, I wanted to talk to you about the concept of the G2 right now. In the Davos vernacular, we talk about China and the United States Is it essential in terms of rebalancing geopolitical power to make it a G3 over time? And when do we get it without me sounding arrogant, but is it going to be India that becomes the member that moves up here to balance out China, the U.S., even on a nuclear power policy standpoint, even on climate change going forward? When do you see that emerging as the real entity?
Well, I don't think India is looking for a place in a G2 or a G4 or even a G5. I think India's almost instinctive preference is for multipolarity. Because India sees its interests best served through a multipolar world. However, having said that, we are faced with a very, very rapidly changing international situation. And I think what the economic and financial crisis has done is to have geopolitical consequences which are still unfolding. We do not know what the world is going to look like in, say, 5 years' time or 6 years' time. With that kind of a international situation emerging, what is very obvious is that whichever way the world moves, India will have a very key role to play in that changing environment. How do we play that role? I think that is the challenge for India. To give you an example, we talk about a shift in the center of gravity of economic power, of even political power, from the west to the east. Now, partly that is the result of the emergence of China, but it was also the result of emergence of India. Now, how do you manage a situation where you have two very large countries which are emerging at the same time? Does not mean that one has to contain the other. I think neither country is small enough to be actually contained, but I think it is a challenge. How do you deal with a situation where two large emerging economies are actually beginning to occupy center stage about the same time? This is something that we will have to deal with in the coming years. With respect to the kind of international order which will emerge as a result of this, I think where India sees its role is it has very good engagement with the United States of America. It is incredible the kind of broad-ranging relationship which has emerged between India and the United States over the past several years. And the India-US civil nuclear agreement is partly the consequence of that broad-ranging relationship which emerged between the two countries. I think that will survive. I do not think that India is looking at a situation where it has to somehow or the other align itself with China to contain the US or align itself with US to contain China. But I think certainly India is looking at a situation where it should be on the side of the table where the rules are being written. You know, they say that if you are not at the table, you may likely be on the menu. And I think that is something which India would certainly like to avoid. Yeah.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to bring up with Mr. Sharma, and if we can, it's not a short answer because it's a big picture item here. Look east. Look at ASEAN and expand the group of ASEAN. Look at China, market access. What is the future for export growth in India, do you think, for the next 10 years in terms of that agenda?
You see, in the wake of one of the worst economic crises that the world has seen after the Second World War, decisions had to be taken. Whether the Indian industry exports and the policymakers will wait for the demand to return in major economies which had gone into sharp contraction, and demand to return also to the pre-recession level, or to be more innovative and creative in embracing the entire world. Because traditionally our exports, 60% of them were to Americas, Europe, Japan. Now we could not have waited. And you cannot call a global approach or a policy which does not look at the entire globe or universe as one. Therefore, we have consciously gone in for engaging other regions, ASEAN, a vibrant economic region, which is India's extended neighborhood, beyond that to the Pacific, and conscious expansion and diversification of markets. It's not only naming the markets. In less than 5 months, 39 markets we clearly identified under 2 incentivized schemes in August when we came out with the foreign trade policy. And we had sectoral reviews, and 2 more we have added. That's China and Japan on the 12th of January. So 41 major markets in one single year, less than half a year. That will help us, our industry, our exporters, to enhance India's share of global commerce. There are many interpretations made how and why India was able to withstand the economic downturn. It's true that our share of global commerce is very little. Trade and services put together 3.5%, trade in goods less than 2%. We have an ambitious target of doubling it by 2014. We have taken policy measures and initiatives, and doubling in percentage share terms by 2020, if not earlier. Remember that this is not something which is suddenly happening, as Saran was referring to, the emergence simultaneously of 2 big economies of Asia, China and India. And it's true that it's not one or the other. As my Prime Minister has said more than once, the world is big enough to accommodate the rise of China and India both. But we consciously went in to sign FTA with ASEAN countries. There were enough brickbats and bouquets. Montek would agree, not easy decisions. Initially, when sharp criticism, is this the time? We went ahead. Because I believe when there are challenging situations confronting leaders and nation states, that's the time to take tough decisions. Because only enhanced global economic engagement will help the world come out of the present recession, will accelerate production and recovery, and also creation of jobs, which has not happened with the weak recovery. And the Look East policy is again very conscious. We cannot be a major economy of the world, which we are and we will be. The 3rd largest economy in less than 2 decades from today, in real terms, not in PPP terms. By not being very intensely engaged with the dynamic economic zones, which is ASEAN, and for that matter, Africa, Latin America, these are the economic development zones of the future. More than 50% of the world's economic growth is coming from the developing countries. If you look at the projections for China, India, for that matter, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, the story will be different if this issue is discussed in 2025. And that's the reason that we have embraced this approach, because India is, in the global context, a country which will play a leadership role, be on the high table, deciding the menu, not looking at the menu, changing a global order. Whether it's accepted or not, it's a reality that the political and economic power of the world is shifting. It cannot stop. Otherwise, we cannot have an orderly transformation. The need of the world to have a representative, equitable, and democratic order is more acutely felt and acknowledged today. And for India to play that role, it becomes an imperative that the economic integration of Asia is there. Earlier, it was ASEAN +3, which had excluded India, and now it is no more. It is the ASEAN +6 and the economic integration of Asia as a continent. And I feel there is every need for that, because Americas have done it through NAFTA, EU has done it, South American countries have done it through Mercosur. In Africa, there are regional economic communities which are coming up. India is linking up with all of them. At the same time, recognizing that first, our extended neighborhood has to be there. And to conclude, if I may point out that centuries ago also India was there, both China and India, contributing 54% of the world GDP. And so well documented over centuries, until the 17th century with the Industrial Revolution, where both our countries and many countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America, which were colonized, became the victims of that accident of history because we lost out on technology. We do not want to lose again. And at the same time, India was the largest trading country of the world. Today we are talking of India's share being less than 2%. So why shouldn't we be aiming for that? And that's the right approach.
Great. Thank you very much. A lot covered in that 2-minute statement, so thank you. I do want to open the floor to questions. Yeah, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes. I'll come here and here first, and then there. Yeah, thanks. If you can be brief, and if you can direct the question to somebody specifically. Thanks.
Actually, it's a question for the panel.
Those are always dangerous.
I know.
I'll apply it to somebody.
Okay, that's
thanks.
fine. In the 2009 WEF Gender Gap Index, India was rated 114th out of 134. Given the enormous evidence around the world of women's involvement in social change, economic change, what can India do to close that gender gap? And can India move forward without half of the population being actively involved?
Okay, excellent question. Reuben, do you want to jump in?
Well, I mean, it's very obvious that you've got to close the gap. What are the ways to do it? I mean, I think that pending legislation to reserve a certain percentage of seats for women is probably a good start, and it's in the right direction. I mean, there's all sorts of things that one could think of in the policy realm, but per se, is it a good idea to have a lot more women participate? Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Here, and then if you can keep perfect. Give to the gentleman, and then the lady can give her a microphone as well. So for the essence of time, please.
India is certainly to be congratulated for the progress it's made over the last 2 decades, yet poverty still remains a very significant problem within your borders, and I was happy to hear Minister Sharma say in a previous session that it's the most important problem. World Bank reports using Government of India data that landlessness is the best predictor of poverty in India, a better predictor than illiteracy, a better predictor than membership in a scheduled caste or scheduled tribe. How does the government think about this, and what can the government do?
Montek, do you want to take that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of this particular study, but what you've got in India is a situation where about 60% of the population depend for the majority of their income on agriculture. You hear 60, 70. I mean, the truth is agriculture is 18% of GDP. 60% of the population depend on agriculture for the majority of their income. Now, you've got to work that out somewhere, right? Because of this large presence in agriculture, I mean, obviously the landless are the ones who are most poor. The solution does not lie in giving them more land. There isn't enough land. The solution lies in doing what Mr. Srinivasan said, getting industrial growth up so that they get employed and taken off agriculture. The objective for India in agriculture should be to raise the rate of growth from, it used to be 2%. It's probably now 3%. That's the progress made. It's not enough. It should be 4%. But, with a 4% growth of output, if the rest of the economy is going to grow at 8, 9%, and population is going to grow at 1.5%, then per capita income in the country as a whole is going to rise at 6.5%. Now, if you want income in agriculture to rise at 6.5% and output rises at 4%, population must move out of agriculture at 2.5% per year. That's the solution.
Good. Thank you very much. The question here.
Well, in the model you propose that is highly dependent on finance abroad, how do you plan to manage currency appreciation? And how do you plan to double your exports in this scenario?
This question is to whom?
I think you did that. Yeah, well, I think for the trade portfolio that you manage, I think it's a good idea. Please.
See, it's, the confidence of the Indian industry, its capacity to innovate, to develop new technologies, induct the same, to increase production, and also to be competitive in the global context. Our exports are increasing, both in goods and in services. At a time when there is a global contraction between 9 and 12% in trade, if you go by the WTO or the IMF studies, we have been able to close the gap. Exports fell continuously for 13 months. in the third quarter of the current fiscal, we have moved to the positive terrain. And in the final quarter, we'll consolidate. Our industrial production had nosedived to 0.1%. Today it is 11.7%. The latest figures will again record an upward trend. So if you juxtapose that to what is happening elsewhere in the world, where the recovery is very weak, 1%, 0.5%, 2%, that too is stimulus-led, stimulus-fed, stimulus-inspired. I'm confident that our industry has that capacity, and I referred to earlier that the various policy initiatives are being made. We are determined to make India the manufacturing hub of the world, and we have the capacity and the human resources. We are investing in those institutions. And we are taking policy measures in that direction. And the coming years will show that result. But everybody cannot be wrong that if we know where China is when it comes to global trade. So if India will be the third biggest economy in less than 2 decades, it cannot be without increasing substantially our share in global commerce, both in merchandise trade and in services. And services already India has acknowledged strengths. They're not going to decline with new young people coming in who are more empowered. Let me tell you that what we have achieved in this field of information technology, communications in the services sector, which is acknowledged, is from a very low base. Even the number of institutions of excellence, the kind of capacity building projects we have. The investments which we are making today will yield dividends in the years to follow.
Okay. We're almost out of time. In 30 seconds, and it's not an easy answer, but Mr. Saran, we didn't cover Pakistan. And I know you have quite an enlightened view of how you can have evolved relations here between India and Pakistan, and much more stable relations and even prosperous relations, if you think about it from a natural gas standpoint, potentially there, trade amongst the two countries. What's your view, if you can? I know it's difficult in 30 seconds, but what's your idea on this front?
I can do no better than refer to what the Prime Minister has consistently been saying, that while he does not have the mandate to change borders, but he certainly has the mandate to make borders irrelevant. Not only with respect to Pakistan, but with respect to all our neighbors. And that fits in with the kind of vision of economic integration which Minister Sharma has spoken about. The fly in the ointment is terrorism. I think if we can evolve a means by which India and Pakistan, together with other partners, can really work together to remove this scourge, which today is impacting on Pakistan's survival itself. I think then the kind of vision that we have been talking about can be realized.
Okay, we'll have to conclude the panel because of time and panels that follow after here. Thank you for the questions from the floor. Thank you, gentlemen, for an excellent debate and being very brief and direct the whole time.